381 of America's most elite operators walked into the Kestrel Highlands on Christmas Eve. By midnight, 43 were already dead. By sunrise, the rest were supposed to follow. Heavy machine guns had sealed every escape route. Mortars were walking rounds closer with every volley. Radio signals died somewhere beneath the blizzard. Air support couldn't fly. Reinforcements were 12 hours out, which meant they were 12 hours too late. Task Force Commander Ethan Cross pressed his back against a shattered boulder, counted his remaining ammunition, and accepted the math. They weren't getting out. Then a single rifle shot crossed nearly 3 miles of frozen mountain air and killed the one man holding the entire ambush together. Nobody knew where it came from. Nobody knew who fired it. Nobody knew her name yet. If this is the kind of story that keeps you awake at night, you're in the right place. Subscribe to the channel right now and hit the bell, because we drop stories like this every week, and you do not want to miss what comes next. Drop a like, and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The convoy stopped at the tree line at 21:47 hours. Ethan Cross climbed out of the lead vehicle and stood in the dark, studying the valley below through his thermal optic. The Kestrel Highlands spread out in all directions, a vast, indifferent landscape of granite ridgelines, frozen creek beds, and spruce forests buried under 3 feet of fresh snow. The blizzard had been building since afternoon. By midnight, it would be a complete whiteout. By morning, nothing would fly in or out of this valley. He'd known all that before wheels rolled. He'd rolled anyway. TOC, this is Crossfire 6 Actual. He pressed the radio handset against his cold ear. We're at phase line echo, 12 minutes to the objective. Copy Crossfire 6. Intel confirms 43 personnel at Whiskey 7. Recommend you move before the weather closes the window. Moving now. He lowered the radio and turned back to his element. Behind him, 381 operators stood in the dark. Navy SEALs, Army Special Forces, Marine Raiders, and attached enablers from 3 different task forces. The largest direct action element he'd ever commanded in a single operation. 381 of the most dangerous human beings his country had ever trained, all of them watching him now in the gray-green glow of their night vision, breath fogging in the killing cold. All right, he said quietly. We have 43 aid workers inside that compound. They've been in there 11 days. We go in clean, we bring them home. Weapons free on armed personnel only. Rules of engagement are tight. I don't want one civilian casualty on this operation. Everyone clear? Murmured acknowledgments. Nobody asked questions. These weren't the kind of people who ask questions at the line of departure. He put his helmet back on and moved into the trees. The first indication that something was wrong wasn't a sound. It was the silence. Sergeant First Class Darren Okafor felt it before he could name it. The absence of wind through the upper branches, the way the snow had stopped creaking under small animals, the complete cessation of the small organic noises that a mountain forest made at night, even in a blizzard. He'd spent 9 deployments in bad places, and he'd learned to trust the feeling that lived between his shoulder blades when something in the environment stopped behaving correctly. 6. This is Okafor. He kept his voice low. I've got a bad feeling about the northern ridgeline. You always have a bad feeling about everything, said the voice to his left. Petty Officer Second Class Jamie Reyes, who had been Okafor's partner on 3 consecutive deployments and had apparently decided that proximity made him an expert on the man's anxieties. And I've been right every single time, Okafor said. Reyes didn't answer that. Ethan heard the exchange on the net, but didn't interrupt. Okafor's instincts had flagged the wrong thing plenty of times, but they'd also flagged the right thing twice, and both times the people who listened to him had walked away alive while the people who didn't had been zipped into bags. Ethan filed the observation in the back of his mind and kept moving. They were 400 meters from the compound when the flare went up, white phosphorus. Blinding. It turned the entire valley into daylight for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for every hostile position in the surrounding mountains to identify, range, and lock onto 381 human shapes moving through the snow below them. Ethan had just enough time to recognize what was happening. Contact, ambush, all elements take... The world came apart. Shit. The machine guns opened from the northern and eastern ridgelines simultaneously. two directions, interlocking fields of fire that covered the open ground between the tree line and the compound with absolute precision. Not suppressive fire, not warning shots, kill shots, aimed and controlled, ripping through the formation before anyone could react. Ethan threw himself into the snow as the rounds tore past his head. The sound was enormous, not the distant pop of a firefight heard from safety, but the full physical presence of large-caliber weapons firing at close range, a sound that hit the chest like a fist and scrambled thought for the first 2 seconds. He'd trained for this. He'd drilled contact ambush procedures until they lived below conscious decision-making. His body was already moving before his mind caught up, rolling left, getting behind a granite outcrop, presenting the smallest possible profile. Around him, the formation was fragmenting into fire teams, everyone finding cover and returning fire by instinct. But the incoming volume was savage. 3 machine gun positions on the northern ridge alone, he counted them by their muzzle flash, plus at least 2 more on the eastern slope, plus what sounded like 82mm mortars beginning to bracket the center of his element. All elements, break contact, move to the ravine, rally at phase line Delta. 6, I can't move. I've got 4 guys down in the open. That was Lieutenant Commander Paris, commanding the westernmost element. Paris, you have to. I move and they're dead, 6. I need suppressive fire on the northern ridge now. Working it, Ethan switched frequencies, tried to raise the air element. Thunderflight Crossfire 6. Actual, we are in a TIC. Troops in contact. I need CAS on the northern ridge line. Break. Static. He switched to the satellite frequency. More static. He looked up at the sky and understood immediately. The blizzard had become a wall, a solid ceiling of cloud and precipitation that had closed the valley completely. Nothing was flying in weather like this. Not fixed wing, not rotary, not drones. They were on their own. The mortars found their range at the 4-minute mark. The first round landed 20 meters short of Ethan's position and blew a crater in the snow that exposed black granite beneath. The second landed 15 meters to his right and put fragments through 2 operators who hadn't made cover yet. Both of them down, one moving, one still. Medic, someone called. Medic northwest. Okafor was already crawling through the snow toward the casualties, keeping his profile below the granite, moving on his stomach while rounds chewed the rock above him. He reached the first man, PO3 Garza, SEAL Team 8, and found a through-and-through on the left thigh, arterial. He got a tourniquet on it in 8 seconds and moved to the second. The second wasn't going to make it. Okafor recognized the chest wound instantly, felt the sucking sound beneath his hand, applied a chest seal from muscle memory, knew it wasn't enough. He radioed it up and kept working anyway, because there was nothing else to do. 6 Okafor. I've got 2 cats, 1 urgent surgical. I need medevac. Working on it, Ethan said, which was a lie. There was no medevac. The weather had ended all aviation 40 minutes ago. If his people needed surgical intervention in the next hour, they were going to die on this mountain. He pressed that thought down somewhere deep and returned to the problem at hand. The geometry of the ambush was elegant in a way that made Ethan furious, even as he was trying to survive it. The attackers had positioned their heavy weapons on the high ground to the north and east, which meant the natural instinct to seek cover behind the ridgelines actually pushed his element toward the compound, which, he now realized, was almost certainly mined. The ravine to the south, which looked like the obvious withdrawal route, was flanked by elevated sniper nests that would turn any movement through it into a shooting gallery. And the forested high ground to the west, the only remaining option, required crossing 600 meters of open, snow-covered slope that was fully exposed to the northern machine gun positions. Whoever had designed this had spent time on it. They'd walked the ground, studied the terrain, anticipated the unit's likely responses, and closed them off one by one. This wasn't an opportunistic ambush. This was a purpose-built trap, engineered specifically to destroy a large American force in a location where no help could reach them, which meant the intelligence that had brought them here was compromised, which meant someone, somewhere, had fed them the aid worker report, knowing it would produce exactly this outcome. Ethan sat behind his rock with rounds impacting the granite above his head and felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. 381 people, He had brought 381 people into a kill zone, trusting intelligence that was manufactured to destroy them. 6. This is Hayes. The voice on the radio belonged to his senior enlisted advisor, Master Chief Tommy Hayes, a man who had survived things that shouldn't be survivable and had developed a calm under fire that bordered on disturbing. I've completed a circuit of the element. I need you to hear me clearly. Send it. We're pinned from 3 sides. The compound is mined. I can see the tripwires from here. The southern ravine has at least 6 elevated positions overlooking it. Western slope is 800 meters of open ground under direct fire. A pause. There's no way out of this using standard doctrine. I know. The machine gun teams on the northern ridge are the priority. We take those out, we might be able to suppress enough to move west. We'd still lose 30% on that slope. Yes, sir. But 30% is better than 100. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He was running the numbers, not because he didn't trust Hayes' assessment. He did, completely. But because he needed to be certain there wasn't an option they hadn't considered, some angle or approach that the ambush designers hadn't anticipated. He couldn't find one. What's our comms status? Satellite blocked by weather. HF is being jammed. I can hear the jamming signal. Ground comms work inside the valley, but nothing gets out. So we're dark to hire. Completely dark, sir. QRF is at least 12 hours out, assuming they know to come, which they won't for another 3 hours when we miss check-in. 3 hours until anyone started wondering where they were. 12 more after that before any help arrived. 15 hours inside a kill zone with no air support, no medevac, no reinforcement, and an enemy force that had clearly prepared for a sustained engagement. Ethan did the math, and the math was not compatible with survival. All right, he keyed his radio. All element leaders, Crossfire 6. We are going to fight our way west. I need suppressive fire on the northern ridge on my mark. All available. The single rifle shot came from somewhere so far away that Ethan barely registered it as a gunshot at first. It sounded wrong, too thin, too clean, the crack arriving a fraction of a second after the characteristic thunder of a high-velocity round breaking the sound barrier at extreme range. Not one of his guys, not the enemy. Something else entirely, from a direction that made no tactical sense. Then the lead machine gun on the northern ridge went silent. Not suppressed, not repositioned. Silent. The way a weapon goes silent when the man operating it is no longer able to operate anything. Ethan pressed his optic against the rock and looked north. The gun team was gone. Not the gun. The gun was still there, barrel still pointing down slope. But the 3 men who had been operating it had collapsed in a pattern that made no sense for outgoing fire. They'd been hit from above and behind, from the mountain above their own position. What the hell was that? Reyes said, somewhere to Ethan's right. Nobody answered because nobody had an answer. Then the second machine gun team on the eastern ridgeline went silent in exactly the same way. Then the mortar position that had been pounding the center of his element for the last 6 minutes stopped mid-volley. Not because they'd run out of rounds, but because the crew had simply ceased to function. Ethan counted. 3 major weapon systems eliminated in under 90 seconds. 1 rifle. He'd been in this business for 19 years. He knew what precision fire looked like, and he knew what impossible fire looked like. And he was watching impossible fire happen in real time, from a direction he couldn't identify, at ranges that fell outside the parameters of anything he'd been trained to account for. Someone was up there. Someone very far away, in a blizzard, in the dark, was systematically dismantling the ambush. 6. This is Hayes. The Master Chief's voice was different now. Not calm exactly, but something adjacent to awe, an emotion Hayes almost certainly did not permit himself under normal circumstances. Are you seeing this? I'm seeing it. Who is that? I don't know. The 4th gun position, an RPG team that had been hammering the western tree line, suddenly lost 2 of its 3 members in rapid succession. The 3rd man dove behind a rock and did not come back up. 6. Unknown element, if you can hear me on any frequency. Ethan released the transmitter, thought for a moment, switched to the emergency guard channel. The one channel that cut through interference. The one every military radio in every theater was required to monitor at all times. Unknown shooter, Crossfire 6. Actual on guard. You are saving lives. Identify yourself. Static. Then, quietly, barely above the wind, you need to start moving. You have maybe 4 minutes before they recover. The voice was a woman's. Ethan Cross stared at the radio in his hand. 4 minutes, Commander. I need you to listen very carefully. The attack helicopters that had seemed to materialize from nowhere were still 200 meters out when Ethan finally allowed himself to breathe. 4 minutes. He had spent 4 minutes listening to a voice he'd never heard before describe a route through terrain he'd never walked, while that same voice was simultaneously, impossibly, engaging targets at distances he couldn't calculate, in weather conditions that should have made the entire exercise academic. Move south-southwest along the dry creek bed. The ice is solid. It'll support your weight. First turn left at the split boulder. Do not go right. Right is mind. He hadn't questioned it. There was no time to question it, and there was something in the controlled precision of the voice. No emotion, no wasted words, the flat economy of someone transmitting pure information under extreme cognitive load that bypassed his normal skepticism entirely. He'd keyed his radio and started giving orders. All elements, Crossfire 6. We are moving south-southwest. Creek bed. Follow the man in front of you. Move now. Duon. The exodus through the ravine was not graceful. It was 381 frightened people moving as fast as they could through knee-deep snow in single file, while rounds from surviving hostile elements cracked through the trees above them, while their own wounded were carried on improvised litters that slowed the column, while the wind increased from brutal to something beyond naming, and the temperature dropped to a point where exposed skin began losing sensation in under 60 seconds. Ethan ran the column, moving up and back, not because he needed to see everything personally, but because his presence at the worst points, the open crossings, the sections where the creek bed narrowed and the column slowed and everyone bunched up, and every hostile gun in the valley had a perfect target, seemed to be the only thing preventing the organized movement from becoming a rout. Keep moving, eyes front, watch the man ahead of you. Okafor was managing the casualties in the middle of the column. 4 litters, 7 walking wounded, 2 men who were stable now but would need surgery within 4 hours or wouldn't be stable for long. He was doing it with the detached efficiency of a man who had run too many casualty collections to waste emotion on the process, calling out instructions to his medics in the same quiet voice he used for everything. Celine on Garza, watch the tourniquet time. Vasquez needs oxygen. Check his seal again. Moore, a pause. Moore's off the litter. Put him down soft. The sentence landed like a weight. Nobody had time to stop. They kept moving. Done. The voice on the guard channel came back at the 4-minute mark, exactly as she'd said it would. Northern element. Machine gun position, 40 meters, you're 11 o'clock. Do not cross the open ground. Ethan hadn't seen it. He looked now and saw the snow-covered hump that didn't match the terrain, the subtle depression in the snowfield where a weapon crew had dug in and covered themselves. A single shot from somewhere above. The position went still. Who are you? He asked. The guard channel hissed for a moment. Doesn't matter right now. It matters to me. Keep moving. He kept moving. Boss. The southern exit of the ravine opened onto a broad, sloping snowfield that descended toward a forested plateau. And across that plateau, if the woman's navigation was accurate, a secondary road that could support vehicle extraction once the weather broke enough for the QRF to push forward. Ethan emerged from the ravine mouth and immediately identified the problem. The snowfield was exposed. 400 meters of open ground with no cover, and on the far slope of the plateau, illuminated faintly by the ambient light of the storm, he could see movement. Vehicles, dismounts, a repositioning force that had anticipated the withdrawal route and was moving to cut it off. 6, this is Hayes. I see them. I see them. We can't go across that field. I know. The guard channel crackled. I see them too. Give me 90 seconds. Ethan wanted to ask what she was going to do with 90 seconds. The blocking force was, he counted, 8 to 12 vehicles, 60 or 70 fighters, entrenched on the high ground above the crossing with clear fields of fire across the entire snowfield. 90 seconds was not enough time to do anything meaningful to that force with a single rifle. He opened his mouth, closed it, waited. The first shot came at the 60-second mark, and it took out what was very obviously the blocking force commander. A man in the vehicle center who was on a radio handset coordinating, the one person that 60 other fighters were looking at to tell them what to do next. The second shot, 4 seconds later, took out the vehicle that had the heaviest weapon, a truck-mounted DSK that would have turned the snowfield into a graveyard. The third shot destroyed the radio antenna on the command vehicle, cutting the blocking force off from whoever was directing them. And then something interesting happened. Without a commander, without communications, without their primary weapon, 60 fighters who had been a cohesive blocking force became 60 individual men in the dark on a cold mountain, none of them certain what was happening or where the threat was coming from, or whether the next shot was going to find them specifically. The organized tactical formation began to dissolve. Not a rout, not yet, but men moving out of the open, seeking cover, pulling back from their exposed positions on the high ground. The snowfield wasn't clear, but there were gaps now. Move. North side of the crossing. Stay low. Move fast. You have maybe 2 minutes. Ethan turned to Hayes. Move the column. Now. Bromton. They crossed the snowfield in 112 seconds. Ethan counted them himself, standing at the far tree line as the column poured past him, watching the hostile positions on the high ground, marking the moment that any of them would reorganize enough to bring effective fire. It didn't happen. The shots from the ridge above kept arriving in carefully spaced intervals. Not rapid, not panicked, the measured cadence of someone making each round count because each round had to count. And every time a weapon crew or a commander or a radio operator in the blocking force tried to consolidate their position, they were immediately addressed. 350, Hayes counted quietly, standing at Ethan's shoulder. 360, 370. The last element, Okafor and his casualty collection, the slowest element in the column, emerged from the ravine mouth at a shuffling trot, litters swaying, medics supporting the walking wounded, every face a mask of exhaustion and controlled fear. 381, Hayes said. Ethan exhaled. 381. Everyone who'd crossed the line of departure tonight was in those trees. Not unscathed. He had dead, he had wounded, he had men who were going to carry the weight of this night for the rest of their lives. But alive, moving, out of the kill zone. He keyed the guard channel one more time. Unknown shooter. All elements are across. You did it. Silence for a long moment, then, get them home, Commander. Something in the phrasing, not congratulatory, not emotional, simply imperative, told him she wasn't celebrating. What about you? He asked. Another silence. I'll figure something out. And then the guard channel went quiet, and somewhere above them on the frozen mountain, the single most lethal individual he had ever witnessed in 19 years of special operations warfare was alone, with whatever ammunition she had left, while the surviving enemy force, which still outnumbered his own element significantly, began searching the ridge lines for the source of the shots that had undone them. Ethan stood at the tree line and stared up at the darkness above. Hayes appeared at his shoulder. Sir, we need to move. I know. Sir, I know, Tommy. He didn't move for another 3 seconds. Who shoots like that? Hayes was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for him. Nobody I've ever seen, he said finally. Ethan turned away from the mountain and started moving his people toward the road. Behind him, somewhere in the frozen black above the ridgeline, a single muzzle flash lit the darkness for a fraction of a second, then vanished. And then the hunting began. The observation post had no name on any map. That was intentional. 3 months ago, when Rowan Voss had first climbed to this position, 11,000 feet above sea level, carved into the granite face of a ridgeline that the Kestrel Highlands maps labeled simply as Sector 7, unoccupied. She had understood immediately why it had been chosen for her. Not because it offered the best vantage point over the valley below, though it did. Not because the natural rock formation provided exceptional concealment, though it did that too. It had been chosen because nobody would come looking for her here. That was the point. That had always been the point. She'd been at this post for 91 days. She knew because she'd scratched a mark into the rock beside the sleeping area every morning when she woke up, the way prisoners mark time, not to track the days exactly, but because the act of marking them gave the days a shape they otherwise lacked up here, where the light changed and the temperature dropped and the snow came and went, but nothing else ever happened. Nothing was supposed to happen. That was her assignment. Observe, report, do not engage. The standing orders were printed on a laminated card that her commanding officer, Colonel Warren Phelps, had handed her personally on the day she'd arrived at the forward operating base before her insertion. He'd held the card between two fingers like it was something slightly distasteful, and he'd looked at her the same way. "You are an observation asset," he'd said, "not a combat asset. You sit up there, you watch, you transmit anything significant through the encrypted uplink, and you wait for extraction. You do not fire your weapon. You do not make tactical decisions. You do not freelance." He'd paused on that last word, weighting it in a way that made clear it wasn't a general prohibition, but a specific reference to something she'd done before. "Are we clear, Captain?" "Clear, sir," she'd said. He'd stared at her for a moment longer than was comfortable, then handed her the laminated card. She'd carried it up the mountain in her pack. It was still there, somewhere under the folded thermal layer she used as a pillow. She hadn't looked at it in 6 weeks. The position itself was austere in a way that went beyond military field conditions into something closer to monastic. A sleeping area barely large enough to stretch out in, carved into the rock and covered with a thermal blanket that reflected body heat back and made it bearable. Not warm, but bearable, on nights when the temperature outside dropped below -20. A small propane burner for water and food, used sparingly because the fuel supply was finite and resupply came on a schedule that prioritized other things above her comfort. A battery-powered uplink terminal for encrypted transmissions to higher headquarters. A chemical toilet situation she'd stopped thinking about in aesthetic terms approximately 3 days after arrival. And the rifle. The rifle was a Precision International AXMC, chambered in .338 Charlie-8 Lapua Magnum, fitted with a Night Force ATACR scope and a suppressor that reduced the muzzle signature to something that could be plausibly attributed to natural sounds at the distances she was working. She'd zeroed it the first day at the position, shooting into the valley floor at a rock formation she'd selected as a reference point, making the adjustments with the calm precision of someone performing a maintenance task. Not exciting, just necessary. She'd fired it exactly twice in 91 days, both times to recalibrate after equipment checks suggested the zero might have drifted. She was not supposed to fire it at people. She'd understood that clearly. She'd agreed to it explicitly. She'd meant it when she said it. The valley below had been quiet for most of those 91 days. She'd documented the movement patterns of the armed groups operating in the sector, their patrol routes, their vehicle traffic, the locations of their fixed positions, the approximate size and composition of their forces. She'd transmitted this through the uplink every 72 hours, receiving acknowledgement signals that told her the transmissions were being received but offered no other feedback. Nobody told her what was being done with her intelligence. Nobody asked follow-up questions. She was, in the most literal sense of the word, a sensor. Input only, no output, no loop. She'd found ways to live with the isolation. She'd always been better at solitude than at company. Too many years of being the only woman in rooms full of men who hadn't decided yet how to categorize her. Not hostile exactly, most of them, but uncertain, the way people are uncertain around things that don't fit their existing frameworks. She'd learned to interpret that uncertainty as a kind of freedom. If they didn't know what to do with her, they mostly left her alone. Phelps had been different. Phelps had known exactly what to do with her, which was to put her somewhere she couldn't affect anything. She thought about that sometimes, up here in the dark. Not bitterly. Bitterness required a kind of sustained attention she'd learned to redirect, but with a clear-eyed accuracy that she found more useful than whatever the emotional alternative was. Phelps had not sent her to this mountain because her skills were best deployed here. He'd sent her here because she'd embarrassed him, and because her presence at any forward operating base under his command was a daily reminder of the thing he couldn't discuss officially but couldn't forgive privately. She understood the mechanics of institutional punishment well enough by now. You didn't discharge someone with her record. The paper trail was too complicated, the inquiry that would follow too inconvenient. Instead, you assigned them to something so remote and so purposeless that either they quit on their own or they quietly disappeared from the operational picture without anyone having to sign anything uncomfortable. 91 days into her disappearance, Rowan Voss had not quit. She also hadn't fired her weapon. Until tonight. She'd seen the convoy arrive at 2147. Through the ATACR scope, in the green-tinted clarity of the starlight amplification, she'd watched the vehicles park at the tree line and the figures emerge and assemble in the dark below the ridge line. The numbers had surprised her. She'd documented the intelligence suggesting a possible rescue operation was being planned, had transmitted it 72 hours ago, but the scale of it was unexpected. More than 300 personnel, a major element, she'd noted it, started a transmission. Then the flare went up. She'd recognized the geometry of the ambush in under 4 seconds. The heavy weapon positions on the northern and eastern ridge lines, the mined approach to the compound, the elevated sniper nests overlooking the southern ravine. She'd been watching those positions build for 11 days. She'd documented each one. She'd transmitted the locations. Somewhere between her transmission and this operation's planning stage, the intelligence had either not been read or not been believed, or had been deliberately excluded from the briefing package. She sat behind her scope and watched the ambush detonate across the valley floor, while the encrypted uplink terminal behind her relayed one thing clearly in her earpiece. Crossfire element, all stations, maintain radio silence unless you have actionable intelligence. Do not transmit on guard. Do not engage. Maintain your position. Colonel Phelps's voice. Tight. Controlled. He knew what was happening down there. He was watching from the TOC through whatever drone feed was available before the weather closed the window. He knew, and he was telling her specifically, because she was the only asset in position to do anything, not to do anything. She kept watching. The first minute was the worst. The formation below fragmented under the initial burst of machine gun fire, and she could see with absolute clarity through the scope, the figures that stopped moving and didn't start again. The machine gun on the northern ridge was the primary killer, a crew-served weapon with an experienced team that had pre-registered the kill zone and was walking rounds through it with systematic efficiency. She could put a round through the gunner from here in her sleep. She kept watching. The second minute. Mortars began walking in from the eastern slope. She'd documented that position too, an 82mm team that had been in place for a week. The rounds began impacting in the center of the fragmented formation, and she watched the survivors scramble behind rocks and into depressions while the mortar crew adjusted fire with the calm professionalism of people who had done this before. Her radio crackled. Phelps again. Voss, I know you're watching. You're not authorized to engage. Acknowledge. She reached over and switched off the radio. The motion was deliberate and calm, the way she did everything. She wasn't angry. She wasn't defiant. She simply understood, with a clarity that felt almost mathematical, that there was a decision in front of her, and that the decision had already been made. Had been made, in fact, the moment the flare went up and she saw the scale of what was happening below, and that what she was doing now was implementing it. She settled behind the rifle. The first calculation took 40 seconds, ranged to the northern machine gun position, 3,847 meters. She'd ranged it 11 days ago, when the crew first emplaced the weapon, and she'd updated the range card every 3 days since as the position shifted slightly. Current reading, confirmed. Wind. The blizzard made this complicated. Surface wind at her position was running approximately 22 knots from the northwest, but she'd been watching the snow movement in the valley for the past hour, and the mid-range wind, the wind the bullet would spend most of its flight time in, was significantly different. Probably 14 knots, more easterly, deflecting as it channeled through the valley. She'd have to extrapolate. There was no clean data at these conditions. There was only the accumulated experience of several thousand rounds fired in adverse weather over a career that had taken her to places where the weather was always adverse. Temperature, -18 Celsius at her position. Air density, high. This would affect the bullet's behavior across nearly 4 kilometers of flight in ways that were calculable but not precisely predictable. She did the math. Not with a ballistics computer. She had one, but she didn't reach for it. The computer would give her a number she'd then have to interpret and adjust based on conditions it couldn't fully account for. She'd been doing this long enough that the adjustments lived in her hands rather than in her head, a kind of kinetic knowledge that existed below the level of conscious calculation. She dialed the scope, adjusted for the wind call, settled her breathing. Her heartbeat was 52 beats per minute. She knew this not from any monitor, but from the sensation she'd developed years ago of feeling each beat as a mechanical event rather than an organic one, something that happened to her body at regular intervals, something she could work around rather than with. The shot lived in the space between beats. She'd learned to find that space no matter what else was happening. Below her, in the valley, a man was dying from a mortar fragment, and another man was trying to keep him alive. She exhaled halfway, found the space, squeezed. At 3,847 meters, the flight time of a .338 Lapua Magnum round is approximately 1.94 seconds. She was already adjusting her scope to the eastern ridgeline's mortar position before the first round arrived. She heard, or rather felt, in some subtle way that was more vibration than sound, the impact. Then the machine gun on the northern ridge went silent, not suppressed, not shifted. Silent, the way a weapon goes silent when the most important member of its crew is no longer able to perform his function. The other two men on the team would take a moment to process what had happened. Then they'd take a moment to panic. She had perhaps 12 seconds before one of them would either man the weapon or break for cover, and in those 12 seconds the gun was effectively neutralized regardless. She didn't use the 12 seconds on the northern ridge. She used them on the mortar. The mortar crew was in a prepared position below the eastern ridgeline's crest. She'd documented the position in detail, knew the layout, knew which of the four-man crew was the gunner and which was the fire direction controller. She put the first round through the FDC man because he was the brain of the crew, the one with the radio and the target data, and the ability to keep the rounds walking accurately onto the formation below. Without him, the other three men were 4 minutes away from being effective again, at best. She made the adjustment, found the space, squeezed, a second and a half of flight time. An impact she couldn't see clearly at this range through the scope, but could assess from the crew's subsequent behavior, which told her everything she needed to know. The mortar went silent. By the third shot, she was calm in a way that was distinct from the forced calm of the early minutes. Not suppressed emotion, but the absence of it, the narrowing of attention to the immediate problem that she'd first experienced during a qualification course 12 years ago, and had spent the subsequent 12 years trying to understand and cultivate. She wasn't thinking about Phelps. She wasn't thinking about the laminated card in her pack. She wasn't thinking about what happened after tonight. She was doing the only thing she was actually good at, in the place that she'd been specifically positioned to do it, and every other consideration had simply ceased to occupy any processing bandwidth. Shot 3. RPG crew on the western slope that had been hammering the tree line and preventing the formation below from moving laterally. 2 men. She addressed the gunner first because without him the launcher was inert. Shot 4. A sniper position on the southern ridgeline that was overlooking the ravine. The escape route she'd already mapped in her head, the only viable corridor out of the kill zone given the position she'd documented over the past 11 days. The sniper in that position was good. She'd been watching him work through the scope, and she recognized quality in the precision of his movements, the economy of his fire. She gave him the respect of her full attention before squeezing. Shot 5. The command element. She'd identified him early, a man in the center of the northern ridgeline position who wasn't manning a weapon, but was clearly directing everything around him, moving between positions, using a radio, pointing toward the valley in ways that were clearly coordinating rather than reacting. Kill the commander and the coordinated assault became a series of isolated gun teams operating without a unifying intent. It didn't end the fight, but it changed the nature of it from a managed execution to a confused reaction. She put the 5th round through him at 3,891 meters, adjusting for a slight position shift he'd made in the 40 seconds since she'd first ranged him. Then she reached for the guard channel. "Well, you need to start moving. You have maybe 4 minutes before they recover." She'd said it before she'd fully decided to say it. The transmission was tactically logical. She'd opened a window, and if the commander below didn't move through it in the next 4 minutes, the window would close and everything she'd just done would buy them a slower death rather than a faster escape. She needed him moving. His response, unknown shooter, crossfire 6. Actual on guard. You're saving lives. Identify yourself. She almost didn't answer. 4 minutes, Commander. I need you to listen very carefully. She knew the ravine route. She'd walked it. Not physically, not from the ground, but through the scope over 91 days, tracing every meter of it, noting the mine placement along the right fork that she documented in her intelligence reports, and that had apparently not made it into anyone's planning. She'd memorized the terrain below her the way she memorized everything. Not as a deliberate act of will, but as an accumulation of long attention, the way a landscape enters you when you look at it long enough without anything else competing for your focus. She gave him the route. Every turn, every hazard, every covered position along the corridor, and then she went back to work. The next 17 minutes were the most technically demanding of her professional life, and she had done things in her professional life that had required a level of technical precision most people in her field would describe as physically impossible. The problem was simple to state and nearly impossible to execute. She needed to suppress or eliminate every hostile position that had sightlines into the ravine corridor, while the formation below, moving slowly because they had casualties on litters, moving noisily because 381 people cannot move silently, moving predictably because the terrain channeled them into a single file, transited the route. Her ammunition supply at the post was what it was. 47 rounds of .338 Lapua at the start of the evening, minus the 5 she'd already fired, leaving 42. 42 rounds across 17 minutes against a target set that included at minimum 43 identified hostile positions. The math required her to prioritize, which required her to think not as a sniper, eliminate individual threats, but as a fire support coordinator, which was a different skill set, one that required her to maintain a continuous picture of the entire battlefield and make resource allocation decisions about which threats to engage and which to suppress and which to ignore in favor of more critical targets elsewhere. She hadn't been asked to do that. Phelps had given her one job, and she'd already violated it beyond recovery. She was now improvising inside an engagement she had no authorization to be conducting, against a force that outnumbered her element significantly, with finite resources and no backup. She did it the way she did everything else, methodically. But the blocking force on the southern plateau was the crisis point. She'd seen them repositioning while she was still managing the ravine corridor, a reserve element that had apparently been held back from the initial ambush, either as an exploitation force designed to pursue survivors or as a blocking element anticipated for exactly this scenario. 8 to 12 vehicles, 60 to 70 fighters, moving to cut off the corridor exit. She had 11 rounds left when she recognized the problem. 11 rounds against a force that size wasn't a military solution. It was a psychological one. She picked the commander first, the man on the radio in the center vehicle, the organizational brain of the force, then the DSHK gunner on the lead truck, because a crew-served weapon in that position could kill everyone coming out of the ravine in under 60 seconds. Then the antenna on the command vehicle, because without communications, the reserve force couldn't receive direction from whatever higher command was orchestrating the overall operation. 3 rounds, 3 targets, 11 seconds, and then she waited because what she needed now wasn't more shooting. It was for 60 men to look around and make an individual calculation about whether staying in their current position was more dangerous than moving out of it. It took 40 seconds. Then the blocking force began to dissolve. She was back on the guard channel immediately. Move. North side of the crossing. Stay low. Move fast. You have maybe 2 minutes. She watched them come. The last of them crossed the snowfield at, she checked the mental count she'd been running, 1 minute 48 seconds. A casualty collection element moving at the pace of the worst off, which was not fast. She counted 381 figures entering the far tree line. She held the count for 30 seconds to be certain, watching the snowfield behind them. Nothing followed. The guard channel came alive in her earpiece. Unknown shooter. All elements are across. You did it. She exhaled, held the rifle still. Get them home, Commander. What about you? She looked at the ammunition remaining in the magazine. 4 rounds. plus the 3 in her vest pocket that she'd been treating as absolute emergency reserve since the engagement began. 7 rounds. She looked at the ridge lines around her position, 3 helicopters that she'd clocked approximately 8 minutes ago, beginning to sweep in expanding patterns. Search pattern, systematic, professional, moving toward the most likely firing positions on the mountain. They'd reached the ridgeline above her in 4 minutes, possibly 3. "I'll figure something out," she told him. Then she began breaking down the position. Cook. The emergency cache was buried 40 meters from the observation post, at the base of a specific rock formation she'd been using as a landmark. She'd emplaced it herself during her first week at the post, not because her orders had included any provision for an emergency cache, but because she'd looked at the terrain and looked at the operational situation and made a private judgment about what a responsible person would do in a position like this one. She'd buried 2 additional magazines of .338 La Pua, 20 rounds, bringing her effective total to 27. 3 days of food. Medical supplies. A secondary radio on a frequency she'd selected independently of the assigned communications plan. A set of cold weather survival equipment, compressed, minimal, exactly what she'd need to survive at altitude in winter without the observation post shelter. She dug it out now in under 3 minutes, working by feel because the ambient light had degraded as the blizzard peaked, her bare hands in the frozen soil because gloves would cost her time she didn't have. Her fingers went from cold to numb to something that registered as pain only distantly, the way pain does when the nervous system begins rationing its attention. She didn't think about her hands. She thought about the helicopters. She could hear them now, not clearly, not the distinct mechanical signature of a specific airframe, but the low pulse of rotor wash channeled through the valley walls, the sound arriving at irregular intervals as the terrain bounced it in different directions. Getting closer. The pattern was systematic, which meant professional, which meant she needed to move before they completed the current sector and began the next one. She sealed the cache bag, shouldered it with her rifle, and moved toward the tunnel entrance. The tunnel had been an accidental discovery during her 3rd week at the post, when she'd been mapping the surrounding terrain during a period of clear weather and had found, beneath a collapsed section of the ridgeline wall approximately 12 meters west of the observation post entrance, a crack in the granite that was wider than it looked and led into a natural passage through the mountain. She'd explored it with a headlamp and found that it ran for approximately 60 meters through the interior of the ridge before exiting on the western face, the face that looked away from the valley, away from the ambush, away from the search patterns. She'd never told anyone about the tunnel. She'd spent 2 weeks quietly widening the entrance crack with the hand tools available at the post, making it traversable with a pack and a rifle. Then had packed the excess material into the snow where it wouldn't be visible from above. Not because she'd anticipated needing an escape route specifically, just because it seemed like the kind of thing a careful person would do. She went in headlamp off, moving by touch, the rifle slung across her back and the pack catching on the narrower sections in a way that required her to twist and push and occasionally curse under her breath in the dark. 60 meters. She counted her paces, reaching the exit in what her count told her was approximately 3 minutes of careful movement. The western face of the ridgeline opened onto a different world, quieter, the wind cut by the mountain itself, the valley below a different valley, unfamiliar terrain dropping away into darkness. She stood at the exit for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, letting her breathing settle. Behind the ridge, she could hear the helicopters completing their sector. She started moving downslope. She'd been moving for 40 minutes when the radio in her vest pocket, the secondary, the one she'd established independently, the one no one else knew about, came alive. She stopped, stood still in the dark and the snow. The voice was not Phelps. "Captain Voss, this is Colonel Adrian Marsh, Inspector General's office. We're monitoring the situation in Kestrel Highlands. We need to speak with you." She stood there for a moment, the radio in her hand, the wind pulling snow sideways across the slope around her. She'd heard the name, Marsh, the IG's office. The office that investigated things. The office that got called when other offices had failed to call themselves. When the normal chain of accountability had developed a gap large enough for 381 people to fall through. She thought about the laminated card in her pack. She thought about Phelps' voice on the radio an hour ago, tight and controlled, telling her not to engage. She thought about the figure she'd watched through the scope not engaging, the man in the center vehicle of the blocking force, before she put a round through his antenna, talking on his radio with the calm certainty of someone who knew the battle was going the way it was supposed to go. "Captain Voss, please respond." She brought the radio up. "I'm here," she said. "Are you safe?" She looked at the slope above her. She could hear the helicopters still working the eastern face of the ridge. They hadn't found the tunnel. They hadn't found her. "For now," she said, "we need you to get to a position where we can extract you. But first," a pause, the kind of pause that contained something important. "We need to know what happened up there, all of it, starting from the beginning." Rowan looked out across the dark valley below, the one she didn't know, the unfamiliar terrain that dropped away into blizzard and shadow. She'd broken every standing order she'd been given. She'd violated her operational mandate completely. She'd fired her weapon, engaged the enemy, influenced the tactical situation, made unilateral decisions about the lives of 381 people she'd never met, based on nothing more than her own judgment that the alternative was worse. And somewhere on the other side of this mountain, those 381 people were walking toward a road, alive, in weather that should have killed them all, because of exactly those decisions. "How much time do you have?" she asked. "As much as you need." She shifted the pack on her shoulders and kept moving down slope, the radio pressed to her ear, the blizzard closing around her on all sides, the helicopter somewhere behind and above and still searching. She started talking, but even as she talked, careful, precise, reporting the events in the chronological order that would be most useful to an investigator, another part of her attention stayed on the terrain ahead, on the ridgelines around her, on the sound of the rotor wash that kept appearing and disappearing in the wind. She wasn't out of this, not even close. And somewhere below, in the valley she'd just saved, a man named Ethan Cross was asking a question that nobody around him could answer, and that she suspected was going to become the most important question of the next several months of her life. Who shoots like that? Nobody, she thought. Nobody shoots like that. She'd spent 15 years being told, in various ways and with varying degrees of politeness, that what she could do wasn't possible, that the ranges she was claiming were fabricated or exaggerated, that the shots she'd made in field conditions had been luck or favorable wind or enemy incompetence rather than skill, that a woman in her position, with her record, with her history of not doing what she was told, that person didn't get to be the best at anything. She got to be a cautionary tale. She'd believed it for a while. That was the thing they didn't tell you about institutional pressure. It didn't just restrict you from outside, it got inside eventually and started rearranging the furniture. She'd spent 3 years after the incident wondering if Phelps was right, if her judgment was genuinely flawed, if the thing she'd done, refused the order that would have put ordnance into a crowd of people, refused it clearly and publicly and in front of witnesses, was stubbornness rather than conscience. 91 days on a frozen mountain had clarified that considerably. Above her, the helicopters began moving in a new pattern, expanding outward from the ridgeline, lower now, covering the descending slopes. They were good. She had to give them that. She switched off the radio, tucked it back into her vest, and altered her route. The night was far from over. She'd been moving downslope for 11 minutes when the secondary radio came back to life. Not Marsh this time. A different voice. Male, clipped, carrying the specific texture of someone transmitting under stress while trying not to sound like it. "Captain Voss, this is Crossfire 6 Actual. I don't know how you got this frequency, and I don't care. I need you to listen." She stopped moving, Ethan Cross. She recognized the voice from the guard channel exchanges, the same flat command register, the same economy, with words that marked someone who'd spent enough years giving orders in bad situations to have stripped all the excess out of them. She pressed the radio to her ear and kept her eyes on the slope above her, watching the helicopter search pattern. They'd shifted again, moving south now, which bought her time on this route, but would close the option within 15 minutes. "I'm listening," she said. "My intel element just pulled imagery from the last drone pass before weather closed. We have 2 additional battalions, estimate 400 fighters, moving on an intercept course with my column. They'll have the road blocked in approximately 40 minutes. She absorbed this. "My people are exhausted. I have 17 litter casualties, 6 of them urgent surgical. My ammunition state is a pause. And in the pause, she heard him making a decision about how honest to be. Not good. We cannot fight through a force that size in our current condition. I understand. Can you do anything? She looked at the pack on her back. 20 rounds from the cache, plus the 4 she'd had remaining before she dug it up, plus the 3 emergency reserve. 27 rounds. She looked at the helicopter search pattern above her. She thought about Colonel Marsh's voice on the radio. We need to speak with you. And the implicit promise of extraction that had lived inside it. She could keep moving downslope. She could keep talking to Marsh. She could be extracted in probably 2 hours, given the weather and the distance. And she could be in a warm room with a cup of coffee and a legal team inside 6 hours, starting the process of dismantling whatever Phelps had built to contain her. She could do all of that. Or she could turn around. What's the intercept point? She asked. Eastern approach to the Plateau Road. There's a natural choke point at the base of the granite formation. The maps call it Ridgeline 7 Alpha. She knew it. She'd ranged every significant terrain feature in the sector during her first 2 weeks at the post. 7 Alpha was a compressed section of the road where the granite pushed in from both sides, reducing the passable width to approximately 12 meters. A perfect choke point. Whoever held the high ground above it controlled passage through it completely. How long do I have before your column reaches 7 Alpha? At current pace, 32 minutes. She did the math. 11 minutes of movement to regain the ridgeline above 7 Alpha, assuming she pushed hard. 7 minutes to establish a firing position on the western face. 14 minutes of engagement window before the column would need to be moving through. 32 minutes. 32 minus 11 minus 7 equaled 14. 14 minutes of work with 27 rounds against 2 battalions. It was not a military solution. She'd already done that math. But it didn't need to be a military solution. It needed to be a psychological one, the same thing she'd done to the blocking force on the snowfield. Find the load-bearing elements of the enemy's command structure and remove them precisely enough and quickly enough that the organization lost coherence before it could execute. I need something from you, she said. Name it. Everything your intel element has on those 2 battalions. Commanders, vehicle types, radio equipment, formation pattern, everything. Transmitting now. She turned around and started moving upslope, back toward the mountain she'd just spent 11 minutes trying to get away from. The climb was punishing in a way that was qualitatively different from the controlled exertion of the earlier descent. She was going up now, in a blizzard, with a pack that was heavier than it had been at the start of the night because of the cache supplies, at an altitude where the air provided approximately 70% of the oxygen her body was demanding. Her thighs burned after the first 3 minutes. After 6 minutes, the burn had spread into her lower back, where the pack's weight was concentrating, and she was breathing in the deliberate, metered way she'd learned for sustained uphill movement at altitude. Not the natural breathing pattern her body wanted, which was fast and shallow and would leave her oxygen depleted within minutes, but a forced pattern, slower, deeper, timed to her stride. She didn't slow down. The intel package from Ethan's element arrived in broken fragments over the next 4 minutes. The radio signal was intermittent at this elevation, the blizzard scattering it unpredictably. And she assembled it as she climbed, building a picture in her head of what was waiting for her at 7 Alpha. 2 battalions, approximately 400 fighters, as he'd said. But the formation pattern told her something more useful than the number. They were moving in a standard vehicle column, which meant their command element would be positioned mid-column as doctrine dictated, protected from contact at either end but accessible to both flanks. She'd dealt with mid-column command elements before. They thought the position made them invisible. It made them predictable. Heavy weapons. 4 truck-mounted DSHKs, 1 per company, plus what the imagery suggested were at least 2 82mm mortar teams traveling with the column. The mortars were her primary concern. If they got those tubes set up on the high ground above 7 Alpha before her column came through, the entire corridor became untenable, regardless of what she did to the command structure. Radio assets. A dedicated signals vehicle near the front of the column, plus individual radios at company level. She needed the signals vehicle early, before the column reached the choke point and the commander started making coordinating calls. She crested the ridgeline at the 12-minute mark, 8 seconds under her estimate, and immediately moved west along the spine toward the 7 Alpha overlook. The helicopters were visible now from this elevation, 2 of them, working the southern slopes in expanding arcs, their searchlights cutting through the snow and columns that swept and found nothing. She was above them. Not by much, but enough. She found the firing position at 19 minutes, a natural depression in the granite crest that gave her a clear line of sight down the eastern approach to 7 Alpha, while keeping her silhouette below the ridgeline. She'd ranged this position during her mapping work. The road below was 2,240 meters away, compressed between the granite walls at the choke point. She settled in, checked the scope, checked the wind. Different here than in the main valley, the ridge creating its own local pattern. The blizzard producing gusts that came in irregular intervals and would require her to time shots into the lulls. She noted the interval pattern, 8 to 12 seconds between the worst gusts. Workable. She checked her ammunition, 27 rounds, loaded in 2 full magazines plus the loose rounds in her vest. Below, she could hear the column approaching 7 Alpha. Not the column. Not Ethan's column. Not yet. The enemy column, moving along the eastern approach, vehicles grinding through the snow, 400 fighters converging on the choke point that would decide whether 381 people lived or died. She found the signals vehicle first. The shot that opened the engagement was, by the objective measures she used to evaluate her own work, not her best of the night. The wind shifted in the half-second before she squeezed, and the round impacted 18 inches left of where she'd intended. Still through the vehicle, still through the antenna array she'd been targeting, still achieving the effect she needed, which was to sever the column's primary communications link before it reached the choke point. But 18 inches left was 18 inches left, and she noted it with the same flat disapproval she applied to her own work, regardless of whether anyone else would have noticed. The signals vehicle lurched sideways as the antenna array collapsed, and she was already transitioning to the second target before the column below had fully processed what had happened. The first DSHK crew. She needed to get to them before they dismounted and set up, because a crew-served weapon in a fixed defensive position on the high ground above 7 Alpha was a fundamentally different problem than the same weapon on a moving truck. She took the gunner while he was still in the vehicle, through the open cargo bed, a clean shot at 2,240 meters that she felt properly the moment the trigger broke. The natural pause, the perfect follow-through, the rifle coming back into alignment in exactly the way it did when everything was right. That one she was satisfied with. The column was responding now. Not panicking, these were not inexperienced fighters, but the loss of comms plus a casualty in the lead vehicle had produced the standard reaction of experienced personnel taking contact from an unknown direction, vehicles stopping, men dismounting, spreading to the sides of the road, establishing cover, which was tactically correct for a conventional ambush, but was exactly wrong for this specific threat, because leaving the vehicles meant leaving the cover the vehicle bodies provided, and it brought them into the open ground flanking the road where she had clean sightlines to everything. She worked fast. Shot 3, 4, 5. The 3 remaining DSHK vehicles in rapid succession, targeting the gunners on each. Not perfect timing. There was a 6-second gap between 4 and 5 as a gust pushed the wind interval outside workable parameters, and she held, breathing, waiting, watching the snow move across the slope below, while a mortar team 200 meters from her position of impact was beginning to set up their tube, and she needed to address them before they had it ready. But within the engagement window she'd estimated. The mortar team first. She transitioned hard and put 2 rounds into the crew before the tube was fully emplaced, targeting the gunner and the man handling the sight assembly. Because without those 2 specific people, the remaining crew members had the equipment but not the knowledge to make it effective quickly. 7 rounds fired. 19 remaining. The column had lost primary comms, all 4 crew-served weapons, 1 mortar capability. It still had approximately 380 fighters, most of them now behind cover on the flanking ground, still capable of walking through 7 Alpha in sufficient numbers to contest passage against Ethan's exhausted element. She needed the commanders. Finding command elements in a dispersed formation under contact was the hardest part of this kind of work, and it was the part where she departed most sharply from what a conventional sniper was trained to do. A conventional sniper identified high-value targets through pre-engagement intelligence, through physical markers, rank insignia, specific vehicles, protective details, or through direct observation of decision-making behavior. All of that worked in a static or semi-static environment where you had time to watch and identify before engaging. She didn't have time. What she had instead was pattern recognition, years of watching command behavior in exactly these circumstances, from distances where individual detail was limited but behavioral signature was clear. Commanders moved differently under contact than subordinates. They moved toward information, not away from it. They made deliberate lateral movements to gain perspective on a situation while everyone around them was making movements designed to minimize exposure. They used their radios continuously and with purpose, rather than episodically and reactively. She found the first one in 40 seconds. A figure moving along the eastern flank of the dispersed formation with exactly the wrong combination of calm and intention. Too calm for a private or a junior NCO under contact, too purposeful for someone who was simply finding cover. He was moving toward the front of the column where the contact had come from, radio to his ear, gesturing back over his shoulder at a small element of fighters who were clearly following his direction. She ranged him. 2,190 meters. Wind in the lull interval, 4 seconds until the next gust based on the pattern she'd been tracking. She had 3 seconds. She shot on 2. The figure stopped moving. The small element behind him stopped moving, and in that moment of organizational paralysis, the moment between a commander going down and the next senior person identifying himself and taking over, she was already transitioning to the second commander she'd been peripherally tracking. Another figure, this one on the western flank, also moving with purpose, also using a radio. Shot 9. Shot 10, which was a mortar observer she'd spotted trying to establish a position on the granite outcrop that would have given him line of sight to 7 Alpha, and the ability to call effective fire onto anything moving through it. 11, 12, 13, 3 RPG gunners, who had moved to positions on the flanking high ground that could engage the road directly. She took them in order of their proximity to the choke point, nearest first, because nearest would fire first. 14, 15. 2 more command-level figures, each identified by the same behavioral signature, each engaged in the brief wind lull between gusts, 12 rounds remaining. The column below had stopped. Fully stopped. Not the tactical pause of a unit establishing a defensive posture, but the confused stasis of a formation that had lost its command structure and its heavy weapons, and its communications in under 5 minutes, and was now experiencing the organizational equivalent of being suddenly blind in both eyes. Individual fighters were still present and still armed, but they were operating without direction, without mutual coordination, without the collective intent that transforms a collection of armed individuals into a military force. She watched through the scope. No movement toward 7 Alpha. She keyed the radio. Crossfire 6, the road is open. You have approximately 10 minutes before they reorganize. Move your column now. A brief pause. Copy. Moving. Another pause. How many rounds do you have left? She looked at the magazine, considered lying, decided against it. 12. The silence on the other end told her he understood the implication. 12 rounds was not enough to repeat what she'd just done, not against a force that was already dispersed and alert and would now be actively working to identify her position. Get out of there, he said. I will. She didn't move. Go, shout. She watched the head of his column emerge from the tree line and begin moving toward 7 Alpha. The lead elements moved fast. She could see through the scope that the point element was an experienced group, spreading wide on both flanks of the road rather than bunching on the road surface itself, covering the movement of the main column behind them. Good. Ethan had good people. The enemy formation on the flanking ground was beginning to stir. Not organized action yet. Still the disoriented movement of individuals who hadn't received direction in several minutes and were beginning to fill that void with their own initiative. But initiative was the precursor to reorganization, and reorganization was the precursor to coordinated action, and she was watching the timeline compress. She put a round into the most active figure on the eastern flank, the one who'd been moving laterally with the most purpose, collecting other individuals around him. The behavioral signature of a junior leader stepping up in the absence of the senior ones she'd already removed. The shot wasn't intended to stop him specifically. It was intended to stop the 3 men around him from continuing to follow him, which it did, because 3 men who watched the person they'd been coalescing around go down were not going to coalesce around the next person immediately. 11 rounds. The main column was through the approach to 7 Alpha now, moving into the choke point itself. The narrowing of the road was visible even at this distance, the granite walls pushing in, the column compressing into a line that would take approximately 4 minutes to transit the choke point fully. 4 minutes. She put a round into a mortar observer who was beginning to establish a new position, a different man from the one she'd shot earlier, which meant they had more mortar-qualified personnel than she'd estimated. He was setting up on the western outcrop now, not the eastern one, which suggested they were learning and adapting. 10 rounds. A burst of fire from the eastern flank. Not aimed at her, not yet, but a probing burst, sent in the general direction that the hostile command structure had presumably identified as her likely firing position based on the shot signature. She'd been moving between shots, never staying in the same spot for more than 2 consecutive rounds. But they were good, and they were narrowing the search area. She shifted position again, moving 15 meters along the ridgeline to a secondary depression she'd noted during her initial survey of the terrain. The movement cost her 45 seconds and exposed her to a wind that hit her face like a physical blow. Minus 25 or lower now, the kind of cold that made extremities unreliable, that turned fine motor control into something you had to consciously negotiate rather than take for granted. She settled into the new position. Below, the column was 2/3 through 7 Alpha. She put a round through the window of a vehicle that had stopped at the edge of the enemy formation and was clearly being used as a command post. She could see the antenna array on the roof, the multiple figures gathered around it, the papers and maps being spread on the hood despite the weather. A field command post, improvised, exactly what a unit that had lost its primary communications and its senior commanders would establish. 9 rounds. The man at the map table went down, the others scattered. 8. A sniper on the eastern ridgeline. She'd been tracking him for 3 minutes, watching him work his way toward a position that would give him line of sight to the 7 Alpha exit. He was good at movement, using the terrain well, but he'd made the mistake of moving upwind of her position, and she'd been able to track him by sound between his own movements. She held off engaging until he committed to a final position, waited until he settled and raised his own optic toward the choke point exit, and then put a round through the rock shelf 6 inches to the left of where his head would be. Not a hit. A miss, but a deliberate one. A message. He was back off that position in under a second, moving away from the ridgeline entirely, not upwind anymore. She didn't follow up. She needed the round more than she needed him gone for good. And a man who had just had a near miss was not going to be a functional fire threat for the next 2 minutes while his nervous system processed the information. 7 rounds. The tail of Ethan's column emerged from the 7 Alpha exit and began moving along the plateau road toward the extraction point. She exhaled. Watched the last figures clear the choke point. Watched the enemy formation on the flanking ground begin its reorganization. Slower now, more careful, but it was happening. They'd have cohesion back in 8 to 10 minutes. They'd pursue. But pursuit at 8 to 10 minutes would be too late, and she knew from the intel package that Ethan's extraction vehicles were already staged 12 kilometers up the plateau road, pushing forward through the clearing weather. They were going to make it. She became aware, in the sudden absence of immediate tactical necessity, that her hands were shaking. Not badly, not in a way that would have affected her shooting. The shaking was happening in a register below the one she operated from when she was behind the rifle, the part of her nervous system that the act of shooting effectively suspended and that came back online afterward like a system rebooting. She looked at her hands in the dim light and watched them tremble slightly and felt neither alarm nor self-consciousness about it. It happened. It had always happened after. She'd spent years worrying that it meant something was wrong with her before she'd come to understand that it meant something was right, that her body had the correct reaction to the events it had just been asked to participate in, and that the shooting only worked because she'd learned to delay that reaction rather than eliminate it. She tucked the radio back into her vest and began moving again. She was 20 meters from the ridgeline when the helicopter found her. Not with weapons, not immediately. A searchlight, white and total, sweeping the granite slope below the crest and then lifting, almost casually, and finding her in a way that felt less like accident and more like the conclusion of a systematic process. She was illuminated completely for approximately 1 second before she moved, throwing herself sideways behind a granite outcrop that was large enough to break the beam. She pressed her back against the rock. The helicopter was close. The rotor wash hit her like a wall, physically pushing at the top of her pack, the sound enormous at this distance. It was circling. She could hear the pattern, the tight orbit of a rotary wing platform that had acquired a target and was maintaining contact while it figured out what to do next. She did a rapid inventory, 7 rounds. No secondary weapon beyond the knife on her thigh and the sidearm in her drop holster, which was good for about 40 meters and completely irrelevant to the helicopter circling 40 feet above her position. The tunnel exit was 60 meters behind her. She'd already passed it, already committed to the forward slope. The downslope terrain offered some cover but would require her to move through the searchlight sweep pattern to reach it. The helicopter made another orbit. Then a second one appeared from the north. She heard the transmission before she registered it fully. Not on the secondary radio, not on the guard channel, but on an open frequency that the helicopter apparently wasn't bothering to encrypt, which told her something about their assessment of the situation. We have her, western face, 40 meters below the crest. One individual, rifle, stationary behind granite. Request confirmation to engage. A pause. Then, in a voice she recognized with a clarity that felt physical, confirmed, engage. Phelps. She pressed herself tighter against the granite and looked at the 7 rounds remaining in her magazine and thought about the geometry of her situation with the same flat analytical attention she brought to everything. Then the third helicopter arrived. But it wasn't like the others. It came from the west, lower than the search aircraft, without a searchlight, moving fast and direct rather than in the searching orbit pattern. And it wasn't alone. She heard the second one a moment later, and then the third, the distinctive low throb of heavily loaded gunships moving with purpose rather than caution. She recognized the sound. American gunships. The transmission on the open frequency cut off abruptly. The 2 search helicopters broke from their orbits in different directions. Not tactical repositioning, but the jerky reactive movement of aircraft that had suddenly acquired a much more significant threat than the woman on the rock below them. Her secondary radio crackled. Captain Voss, this is Extraction Flight Kilo. We have you on thermal. Do not move. We are coming to you. She didn't move. She pressed her back against the cold granite and watched the dark sky above her fill with the shapes of American aircraft. And she felt something move through her chest that wasn't relief exactly. Relief was too simple, too clean for what this was. But something in that neighborhood, something warm and complicated and a little bit raw, the way feeling comes back into frozen hands. Painful at first, then, gradually, something closer to right. Below the mountain, on the plateau road, 381 people were moving towards safety. Above the mountain, in the dark, the aircraft that had been sent to kill her were retreating into the blizzard. She sat against the rock with 7 rounds and a broken command structure and the slowly returning sensation in her hands, and she waited for the extraction bird to reach her. She'd have a lot to answer for. She found, sitting there in the dark, that she didn't mind. The extraction bird set down on a plateau, clearing 4 kilometers west of 7 Alpha, and Rowan walked to it under her own power. That mattered to her. She wasn't sure why it mattered as much as it did. She had broken ribs from where she'd slammed against the granite when the first helicopter's rotor wash hit her, and the hypothermia had progressed far enough that her fingers weren't responding with full reliability. And the bruising across her left shoulder from the pack strap had stiffened into something that made every arm movement a negotiation. But she walked to the aircraft without assistance, rifle slung, pack on, moving at the same deliberate pace she'd maintained all night. The crew chief reached out a hand to help her up the ramp. She looked at it for a moment. Took it. Inside the aircraft, the heat hit her like a wall. She sat down on the bench along the starboard side and didn't move for the first 30 seconds of flight, letting her body process the transition from 20 below to something survivable. Her hands were shaking again, worse than before, a visible tremor that she couldn't fully suppress, and she pressed them flat against her thighs and looked at the floor of the aircraft and breathed. The crew chief handed her a foil blanket without being asked. She took it, wrapped it around her shoulders, kept looking at the floor. Across from her, a young PFC with wide eyes and the expression of someone who had been briefed on what she'd done but hadn't fully processed it yet was trying not to stare. He was failing. She'd spent most of her career being stared at for one reason or another, and she'd developed a general policy of not acknowledging it, which she applied now. The radio in the cockpit came alive. "Kilo Flight, be advised. We are routing you to Bravo Station, not the FOB. Repeat, not the FOB. Bravo Station. Acknowledge." The pilot's response was calm and professional. "Copy. Routing to Bravo Station." Rowan looked up. Bravo Station was not a medical facility. Bravo Station was the Forward Intelligence Processing Center, a hardened building 12 kilometers behind the line, where they took people they wanted to debrief before anyone else got to talk to them. She knew what being routed there instead of the FOB meant. It meant someone senior had made a decision about the order of operations. Information first, treatment second. She could object. She had the legal standing to demand medical assessment before any formal proceedings. Marsh's contact gave her a thread she could pull. She looked at her hands. The tremor was slowing. "How long to Bravo Station?" she asked the crew chief. "About 20 minutes, ma'am." She nodded, closed her eyes. "Use the 20 minutes." Bravo Station looked the way forward intelligence facilities always looked. Temporary in its construction, but permanent in its intent. A series of modular units connected by covered walkways, surrounded by the kind of perimeter security that was designed more to control movement than to stop an assault. Lights blazing at 0340 in the morning. Vehicles parked in the organized chaos of a facility operating at a tempo it hadn't been designed for. She was met at the ramp by a major she didn't know. A staff officer. She read him immediately by the way he held his clipboard and the way he didn't quite make eye contact, the bearing of someone executing instructions rather than making decisions. And two MPs who flanked her with the studied neutrality of people who had been told specifically not to touch her unless she made it necessary. "Captain Voss." The major consulted his clipboard. "I'm Major Elkins. I'll be processing your arrival." "Processing," she said. "Standard procedure for—" "I know what it is." She started walking toward the facility entrance. "Where's Colonel Marsh?" A pause behind her. "Ma'am, Colonel Marsh isn't—" "Where is she?" Another pause. She heard Elkins moving to catch up. "Colonel Marsh is in the main conference room, but there's a sequence of—" "Take me to her." She heard one of the MPs shift. Heard Elkins make a small sound that might have been the beginning of an objection. "Major," she said, without turning around, "I have been awake for 22 hours. I have broken ribs and hypothermia, and my fingers stopped working correctly about an hour ago. I have answered every question I was asked via radio during my extraction, and I will answer every question I'm asked in writing. But right now I am going to walk into that building, and I'm going to talk to Colonel Marsh, and the two MPs behind me are going to make a decision about whether to put their hands on a captain who just spent the night eliminating hostile positions on behalf of 381 American personnel." She stopped walking, turned around, looked at all three of them. "What's it going to be?" Major Elkins looked at his clipboard, then at the MPs, then at her. "Conference room is this way," he said. Colonel Adrienne Marsh was 53 years old and had the kind of face that came from spending 30 years watching institutions fail to do the things they were built to do. Not bitter, but specifically unimpressible. The face of someone who had heard every version of every story and was primarily interested in the one detail that changed the outcome. She was standing at the far end of the conference table when Rowan came in, a coffee mug in her hand, reviewing something on a tablet. She looked up, assessed Rowan in approximately 1 second, and set the mug down. "Sit down, Captain." "I'm fine standing." "I can see that." Marsh's tone was dry. "Sit down anyway. You've been on your feet for 22 hours, yes." Rowan pulled out a chair and sat. "You said you had questions." "I have a significant number of questions." Marsh sat across from her, folded her hands on the table. But first, are you injured? Broken ribs, probable mild hypothermia, bruising, nothing that requires immediate intervention. I'm going to have a medical officer make that assessment, not you. After. Marsh looked at her for a moment. After, she agreed. There was a recorder on the table between them. Marsh reached over and started it, stated the date, time, location, and participants for the record, and then put her hands back on the table. Walk me through it from the beginning, she said. Not the engagement. I have the radio transcripts. I want the context. How long were you at the observation post? What were your standing orders? And what was Colonel Phelps's stated rationale for those orders? Rowan looked at the recorder. 91 days, she said. Standing orders were observe, report, do not engage. Phelps's stated rationale was that my presence as a combat asset would compromise the observation mission. A pause. His actual rationale was different. Tell me about the actual rationale. 14 months ago, I was attached to Task Force 77 during an interdiction operation in the Ardal Corridor. The mission was to strike a vehicle convoy suspected of carrying command personnel. She kept her voice level, the same flat delivery she used for everything. I was positioned as the primary shooter. During the pre-engagement phase, I identified the convoy as civilian, not military, not dual use. Private vehicles, families. I reported my assessment to the forward controller and requested a stand-down. And? The controller passed it up. Phelps was the senior officer on the operation. He reviewed my assessment and directed me to engage. She paused. I refused. Marsh didn't react. On what basis? On the basis that shooting civilians is wrong. She said it simply, without edge, the way you state a fact that shouldn't require elaboration. The convoy was later confirmed to be non-combatant, 12 vehicles, 38 people, including children. What happened after you refused? A different asset engaged the convoy. She stopped. Let that land. 3 vehicles were struck, 9 killed, 14 wounded. Post-strike assessment confirmed non-combatant status. She looked at the recorder. Phelps filed a report attributing the engagement decision to intelligence failure at the collection level. My refusal was characterized as a breakdown in fire discipline and an unauthorized deviation from operational orders. Marsh was quiet for a moment. Outside the conference room, Rowan could hear the facility running. Voices, footsteps, the low hum of generators. Somewhere down the corridor, someone was on a phone, speaking in the clipped cadence of someone receiving difficult information. Your disciplinary record shows a formal counseling for failure to follow lawful orders, Marsh said. Yes? And subsequent reassignment to observation duty. Yes. The observation post with standing orders not to engage. Yes. Marsh picked up her coffee mug, held it for a moment without drinking. The intelligence you transmitted from the observation post over the past 91 days, the documented hostile positions, the weapon emplacements, the force disposition. Was that intelligence incorporated into Crossfire Element's planning package? I don't know. Do you have reason to believe it wasn't? Rowan thought about the ambush, the precision of it, the way it had accounted for every obvious response. The machine gun position she'd documented 11 days before the operation, the mortar team she'd ranged and reported, all of it exactly where she'd said it would be, and apparently entirely absent from any briefing the operators below had received. Yes, she said. Tell me. She told her. They were 40 minutes into it when the door opened without a knock. Rowan didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The quality of Marsh's expression, not surprise, but the particular stillness of someone who had anticipated a confrontation and was now calibrating the terms of it, told her. Colonel Warren Phelps walked into the room like he owned it, which was how he walked into every room, the bearing of a man who had spent enough time in charge of things that spatial ownership had become automatic. He was in field uniform, which meant he'd come directly from the TOC, and there was a line of tension through his jaw that Rowan recognized from the last time she'd seen him in person, 14 months ago, in a different room, a different confrontation, a different set of consequences that had not ultimately landed on the person who deserved them. He looked at Rowan. She looked back at him. Colonel Phelps, Marsh said, this is a closed proceeding. I'm the senior officer in this sector. He didn't look at Marsh. He was still looking at Rowan. I have operational authority over... You have operational authority over the sector, Marsh said, her voice carrying the specific patience of someone who is prepared for exactly this argument. This proceeding falls under IG jurisdiction, which supersedes operational authority in matters of... She violated standing orders. He said it directly to Rowan, as though Marsh hadn't spoken. She was specifically directed not to engage. I have that transmission on record. You do, Rowan said. Then you understand what happens next. I understand what you want to happen next. She kept her voice even. I also understand what happened before, which is what Colonel Marsh and I have been discussing. Something moved across Phelps' face, not quite fear, but its precursor, the recognition that a situation he'd believed he controlled had developed a dimension he hadn't accounted for. Whatever she's told you, he said to Marsh, she has a documented history of insubordination, and... Colonel? Marsh's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Sit down. He didn't sit. The transmission directing Captain Voss not to engage, Marsh continued, was logged at 22:19 hours. The ambush began at 21:47, which means you were in the TOC observing the engagement, and your response to watching 381 American personnel being killed in a prepared ambush was to order your only asset in position to do nothing. She set down her coffee mug with a small, final sound. I'd like you to explain that to me. Phelps's jaw worked for a moment. It was outside her operational mandate, he said. That's not an explanation. That's a restatement. She had no authorization. Colonel? Marsh's voice went quiet in a way that was more effective than volume. I've been doing this job for 11 years. I know what operational mandate sounds like when someone is using it to describe a genuine constraint, and I know what it sounds like when someone is using it to cover something else. She held his gaze. The question I am asking you to answer is not about her mandate. It is about your decision. You were watching 381 people die. You had an asset in position to help them, and you ordered that asset to stand down. A pause. Why? The room was very quiet. Phelps looked at Rowan again. She could see him working through it. The calculations, the exposures, the thing he'd spent 14 months building and was now watching develop structural failures in real time. I want a lawyer present, he said. That's your right, Marsh said. We'll pause the recording. She reached over and stopped it. In the silence that followed, Phelps left the room. Rowan sat in the chair and looked at the stopped recorder and felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, nothing like that. Not satisfaction in any clean sense. Something more complicated. The tired recognition that the thing she'd been carrying for 14 months was still her problem, had always been her problem, was going to remain her problem through whatever process came next, because institutional truth-finding was slow and expensive and exhausting. And the people it ground up most thoroughly were the ones doing the grinding. He'll negotiate, Marsh said. I know. It'll take time. I know that too. Marsh looked at her for a moment. A different kind of look than before. Less the investigator's assessment and more the evaluation one professional makes of another when the formal context has briefly lapsed. You saved 381 people, she said. Yes. And you're sitting in a modular building at 4 a.m. answering questions while the man who let it happen almost is down the hall lawyering up. That's generally how it works. It shouldn't be. No, Rowan agreed. It shouldn't. Marsh picked up her tablet, made a notation. The formality returned. Not coldly, but because that was what the situation required, and they both understood it. I'm going to need your written account. Everything from the beginning of your assignment to the end of the engagement tonight. Dates, times, transmissions, decisions. I can have it done by... Not tonight. Marsh said it firmly. Tonight you're going to see the medical officer. Tomorrow you start writing. Rowan almost argued, caught herself. All right, she said. The medical officer was a captain named Brewer, who had the efficient manner of someone 3 years into a job that regularly presented him with people who needed more care than they were willing to accept. He examined her without comment, noted the rib fractures, 2 confirmed, 1 probable, the mild hypothermia, the bruising, the soft tissue damage in her left shoulder, and the fact that her core temperature, while back in a survivable range, was still 2 degrees below where it should be. "You need rest," he said. "Real rest, not 4 hours and back to it." "I understand." "You've been operating at altitude in a blizzard for—" "I understand, Captain." He looked at her over his clipboard with the expression of a man who had heard that particular tone before and knew exactly what it meant. "I'm going to put you in a room with heat and a bed. You're going to sleep. I'm going to check you in 6 hours. If your temperature is back and the pain is manageable without intervention, we discuss what happens next." He paused. "If you leave that room before 6 hours, I'm documenting it." "Fine. Is there anything else you need?" She thought about it. "Is there any news on the crossfire element?" Brewer's expression shifted slightly. "They reached the extraction point about 40 minutes ago. All 381 accounted for. I heard they had 17 litter casualties, but last I knew, all of them were en route to the surgical facility." She nodded. "All of them?" she asked. "Last I heard." He held her gaze. "That's because of you." She didn't answer that. There wasn't a right answer for it, not one that was honest and also comfortable. So she said nothing and let him take her to the room. She didn't sleep. She lay on the cot with the heat running and stared at the ceiling, and her mind kept returning to the same sequence. Not the shooting, not the calculations, not the command decisions. The moment before the first shot, the 40 seconds of math while the machine gun on the northern ridge was killing people, and she had the ability to stop it and was making a choice. She'd made choices like that before. She knew the weight of them. She also knew, and this was the part she'd never been able to explain to anyone who hadn't stood in exactly that position, that the weight didn't work the way people who hadn't been there imagined it did. It wasn't the weight of playing someone's final judge. It was the weight of being the only tool available for a specific function at a specific moment, and knowing it, and understanding that not using the tool was a decision too, one with consequences just as concrete and just as irreversible. Phelps had taught her something that night 14 months ago, and she'd spent the subsequent 14 months processing the lesson. What he'd taught her was that some orders existed not to achieve military objectives, but to protect the person giving them. That the institutional apparatus around her, the orders, the mandates, the documented procedures that existed ostensibly to regulate violence in service of legitimate ends, could be and was weaponized to produce outcomes that the institution officially prohibited. She'd known that before, abstractly. She knew it differently now. Her ribs ached with every breath, a specific pain that was actually useful. It kept her present, kept her from sliding into the exhausted unreality that wanted to pull her under. She pressed her fingers against the bruised area along her left side and felt the pain sharpen and used it as an anchor. 381 people. She let herself have that for a moment. Not the pride of it. She'd learned long ago to be suspicious of pride in this specific context, because the satisfaction of a shot well executed could become, if you weren't careful, its own kind of corruption, an aesthetic pleasure in something that should carry only moral weight. But the simple fact of it, people who were going to die weren't dead. Families that were going to receive the worst possible communication had not received it. Children who were going to grow up with a permanent absence at the center of their lives were instead going to have a father come home. She'd done that. Her specific, peculiar, hard-built skill set had produced that outcome. She held it. Let it be real. Then she heard footsteps in the corridor, not Brewer's, she'd already cataloged his gait, and the voices that accompanied them. 2 people, one of them doing most of the talking, the other providing brief acknowledgments. She couldn't make out the words through the door, but the cadence and the register told her, military, mid-grade, someone being escorted somewhere. The footsteps stopped outside her door. A knock, precise, not the knock of a staff officer executing a procedure, soldati. The knock of someone who'd rehearsed the approach because they weren't sure of the reception. She said nothing. The knock came again. "Captain Voss?" A voice she recognized. "It's Ethan Cross." She lay still for a moment, then she pushed herself off the cot, carefully managing the ribs, and crossed to the door and opened it. He looked worse than she'd expected and better than he had any right to. He was still in field kit, mud and snowmelt tracked into the corridor behind him. There was dried blood on his left sleeve that wasn't his. She read the absence of injury on that arm, noted the position, cataloged it as a casualty's blood from a medevac or a carrying position. His face had the particular blankness of someone who had been awake too long and had too much to process and hadn't started yet. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back. "You're shorter than I expected," he said. "You're not the first person to say that." "I imagine not." He didn't smile, but something around his eyes shifted. "Can I come in?" She stepped back. He came in, looked around the sparse room, cot, heat unit, her pack and rifle leaning against the wall, and remained standing, which she respected. "I heard you might be facing charges," he said. "I might be. For saving my people. For violating standing orders. The outcome is a separate question from the procedure." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a fairly calm way to look at it. I've had time to think it through." "You've had about 4 hours." "I think efficiently." He almost smiled again. Almost. "My element is filing statements. All of them. Every operator who was in that valley tonight is putting their account in writing, and every account is going to say the same thing, which is that without an unidentified shooter in the mountains, none of us would have made it out." He paused. "I want to know if that helps you." She thought about it honestly. "It might. Depends on how the proceedings go." "What can I do?" She looked at him. Really looked. The way she looked at things when she was trying to understand them rather than assess them. He'd come here at whatever time it was in the morning, before sleep, before debriefing, before any of the institutional processes that were going to consume the next several weeks of his life, and he'd come specifically to ask what she needed. She'd spent 14 months invisible. She'd been deliberately made invisible, stationed on a mountain that nobody checked, transmitting intelligence that nobody used, existing as a bureaucratic disappearance inside an operational command that had decided the most convenient version of her was the absent one. It was a strange thing, being seen. "Your statements help," she said. "Keep writing them." "Done." He nodded once, the decisive nod of someone crossing off an action item. Then he looked at the rifle against the wall. "How far was that first shot?" "Ranging estimate was 3,847 meters. He was quiet for a moment. "I've been in this business 19 years, he said. "I've worked with the best shooters in every branch. Marine Scout snipers, Army Special Forces, SEAL snipers, British SAS. He paused. "I have never seen anything like what I watched tonight, and I didn't even see it. I inferred it from the results." The conditions were manageable. "Captain," his voice was dry. "It was -20 and a Category 3 blizzard." "Manageable," she said again. He shook his head slowly. Not in disbelief, in a kind of surrender to a reality he couldn't fully account for. "Who trained you?" "A lot of people. Over a long time." "What's your longest confirmed shot? Before tonight?" She looked at him. "That's classified," she said. "By how much?" "Significantly." He accepted that, stood there for another moment, and she could see him working through something, the beginning of a larger question that he hadn't decided yet whether to ask. "You knew the routes," he said. "The ravine, the creek bed, the minefield in the right fork. You knew all of it." "I'd been watching the valley for 91 days. "Your intelligence reports were received," she said. "Whether they were read is a different question." The implication settled between them. "The ambush used positions you documented," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Which means whoever planned the ambush either had access to your reports or independently selected the same positions." "Yes." He was quiet for a longer moment this time. Outside the room, the facility continued its low-level operational hum, the sound of an institution processing a night that had gone very wrong and was now trying to determine, with the measured deliberateness of institutions everywhere, exactly whose fault that was. "There's going to be an investigation," he said. "There already is." "I mean a bigger one. What happened tonight didn't happen because of bad luck or poor planning. Someone put us in that valley knowing what was there. His voice was controlled, but underneath the control was something that had been building since 2147 hours. Since the moment he'd pressed his back against a rock and done the math and found that the math was incompatible with survival. Someone fed us that intelligence. Someone made sure we didn't have the right briefing package. Someone decided that 381 people were acceptable to lose. He looked at her. You know who. She held his gaze. I know some of it, she said carefully. Then you need to stay alive long enough to tell someone with the authority to do something about it. Colonel Marsh has authority. Marsh has IG authority. What I'm describing is... He stopped. Started again. What I'm describing is potentially bigger than an IG action. She knew. She'd been thinking it for hours. The size of the coordination required, the intelligence access needed to manufacture the aid worker report convincingly enough to pass vetting, the operational knowledge of her own transmission schedule, and the gaps in her reporting cycle that had allowed the ambush positions to be finalized after her last report and before the operation launched. That level of coordination didn't happen at the field level. She looked at her hands. The tremor was gone now. They were steady, which was the only physical thing she could honestly say had improved in the last 4 hours. Get some sleep, she said. You look like you're about to fall over. He blinked. Apparently hadn't expected the pivot. I'll sleep when your people are in surgical and there's nothing more you can do tonight, she said. Which is now. Go. He looked at her for a moment. She could see him weighing the dismissal, deciding whether to push back. And then something in his posture shifted. The controlled bearing of a man who had been running on command will for too many hours, acknowledging that the tank was genuinely empty. I'll be in the facility until morning, he said. If you need anything. I won't. If you do. She almost smiled. Almost. Go, Commander. He left. She stood in the middle of the room for a moment after the door closed, the quiet settling back around her, the heat unit cycling, the distant sounds of the facility continuing its work. Then she went back to the cot. She didn't sleep for another hour, but the hour was quieter than the ones before it, and eventually the exhaustion won, and she went under, dreamlessly, into the first real rest she'd had in 91 days. She'd need it. The morning was going to be very loud. She was right about the morning. It started at 6:12 with Brewer checking her temperature, back to normal, which he noted with the satisfaction of a man whose predictions had been validated, and progressed within the hour into the kind of institutional noise that she'd been expecting since the extraction bird set down. Lawyers arrived first, then a second IG representative she hadn't spoken with before, then a 2-star general named Holcomb, who had flown in overnight from the regional command, and who sat across from her in the same conference room where she'd spoken with Marsh, and looked at her with the expression of a man who was working very hard to understand something that kept refusing to fit into his existing categories. Walk me through the shot data, he said. I've given Colonel Marsh a written account. I want to hear it from you. She walked him through it. Ranges, wind calls, environmental adjustments, target selection rationale, sequence of engagement. She kept it factual and sequential, the same way she'd written the formal account at 0430 before Brewer had finally insisted she stop and sleep. Holcomb listened without interrupting, which she appreciated, and when she was done, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The first shot was at 3,847 meters, he said. In a blizzard. Correct. At night. The starlight amplification on the ATA-CR is... I know what the optic does, Captain. He looked back at her. I'm trying to understand how a human being executes that shot under those conditions. The same way you execute any shot. You control the variables you can control. You account for the ones you can't. You find the space and you squeeze. There's no shot like that on record. There are several, she said. They're classified. He stared at her. Yours? She didn't answer. He looked at the table, then at Marsh, who was seated to his left, then back at Rowan. What do you want out of this? He asked. The question was direct in a way she hadn't expected from a 2-star in a formal proceeding, not procedural, not institutional, but genuinely asking. "I want the truth about the Ardal corridor operation on record," she said. "I want the intelligence failures from last night's operation investigated fully. And I want to go back to work. You understand there are still procedural questions about my engagement last night." "Yes, sir, I understand that." She kept her voice even. "I also understand that if I hadn't engaged, we wouldn't be having this conversation because there would be nobody to report 381 casualties to." Holcomb was quiet for a moment. "The formal proceedings are going to take time," he said. "I know. You're going to be in a holding status while General." She leaned forward slightly. "I have been in a holding status for 14 months. I can manage more of it." She held his gaze. "What I cannot manage is someone in this chain of command making the same decision again. The decision to sacrifice American personnel to protect an operation or a career, while I'm sitting in a room somewhere waiting for a process to complete." She paused. "That is what I need you to understand. Not for my sake. For the next time." Holcomb looked at her for a long moment. Then he closed the folder in front of him. "Colonel Marsh," he said, "what's your assessment?" Marsh didn't hesitate. The engagement was unauthorized under standing orders. The standing orders were themselves the product of a retaliatory reassignment following a legitimate refusal of an unlawful order. The intelligence Captain Voss transmitted from the observation post was either not incorporated into the Crossfire Elements planning package or was deliberately excluded. The stand-down order issued during the engagement. She paused, and the pause carried weight. That order requires a separate investigation. You're recommending? Suspension of all disciplinary proceedings against Captain Voss pending the outcome of the broader investigation. Immediate review of Colonel Phelps' conduct in both the Ardal corridor incident and last night's engagement. Holcomb nodded slowly. "Done," he said. Not the careful language of a man buying time, the flat finality of someone who had made a decision and was moving to the next problem. "Captain Voss, you're not facing charges, not from this command." She absorbed that. "Thank you, sir," she said. It came out quieter than she'd intended. Phelps was gone by noon. Not physically. He was in a room down the corridor with 2 lawyers and a JAG officer, and would remain there for hours, working through the mathematics of what could be negotiated and what couldn't. But he was gone in the way that mattered. The authority he'd held over the sector, over the operational picture, over the specific corner of the institutional apparatus that had been deployed to contain Rowan Voss, had been suspended pending the investigation, and the suspension had the feel of something permanent rather than procedural. She heard it from Marsh, who came to her room at 11:30 with 2 cups of actual coffee. Not the battery acid from the machine in the corridor, but something from a press that someone had apparently brought from the main FOB, and sat across from her and said it plainly. "His access is suspended, the Ardal corridor files are being pulled, and..." A brief pause. "We found the gap in your intelligence transmissions." Rowan looked up. "The report you filed 11 days before the operation, the one documenting the heavy weapon emplacements on the northern ridge. It was received at the signal center." Marsh set down her cup. "It was received, logged, and then administratively reclassified to a lower priority queue. The reclassification was done manually. It had an authorization code." "Whose?" Marsh held her gaze. "That's what the investigation is determining." Rowan sat with that. Not with anger. She'd expected something like this, had been running the probability in the back of her mind since the conversation with Ethan at 0400. The ambush had required foreknowledge that the Crossfire element would be in that valley at that time. The aid worker intelligence had passed vetting. The ambush positions had been refined after her last transmission. Someone with intelligence access and operational awareness had connected the dots in a specific direction, and the dots connected to the same person whose standing orders had kept her silent while it happened. "Will it stick?" she asked. "The reclassification is documented. The authorization code is traceable." Marsh picked up her cup again. "It'll stick." Rowan nodded. They sat for a moment in the specific silence of 2 people who have been working toward a thing and have arrived at it and are not quite sure yet how to inhabit the arrival. "What happens to my record?" Rowan asked. "The Ardal corridor counseling is being reviewed. Given the post-strike assessment confirming non-combatant status, Marsh stopped, chose her next words carefully. The formal finding was that the engagement decision was made at the operational level based on intelligence that didn't reflect ground truth. Your refusal to engage is documented as a separate action. The review will likely recommend the counseling be expunged. Likely. I can't promise an outcome. I know. Rowan looked at her coffee. I stopped expecting promises a while ago. Marsh studied her. You're not... She stopped, started again. Most people, when something this significant shifts in their favor, they're... Relieved? Rowan said. I am. It just doesn't look the way people expect it to. Marsh almost smiled. No, I suppose it doesn't. What? Ethan Cross came back at 1400. He looked better than he had at 0400. He'd slept. She could read it in the quality of his attention, the return of a focus that exhaustion had been softening around the edges. He was in a fresh uniform, which meant someone had arranged for gear transport, which meant the administrative machinery around him was functioning in the way it functioned around commanders whose survival was expected and planned for. He sat across from her in the small room and put something on the table between them, a folded piece of paper. She looked at it, didn't touch it yet. 381 signatures, he said, one per operator in my element. I told them what you did, the full account, as much as I could reconstruct from the radio transmissions and the ballistics and what you told me last night. He nodded at the paper. Every one of them signed. Formal statement requesting recognition rather than disciplinary action. We submitted it to General Holcomb's office an hour ago. She looked at the paper for a moment. Then she picked it up, unfolded it. The signatures started at the top of the first page. Neat, messy, small, large. The entire spectrum of how people wrote their names when the act of writing them was meant to carry weight. She turned the pages slowly. The names went on for longer than she'd expected, even knowing the number, because seeing it as a list of individual people rather than a collective statistic was different. Each name was a person who had been in the valley last night. Each name was someone who had understood, in the specific and irreplaceable way that comes from having been there, what the alternative had been. She folded the paper, set it back on the table. Thank you, she said. We didn't do it for thanks. His voice was direct. We did it because it's right. He paused. And because there's going to be a next time, for some of them, probably for me. And what happened last night needs to be on record, so that when the next person is in a position like yours, there's a precedent for what the right decision looks like. She looked at him. You think about the next time, she said. Even now. It's the job. He held her gaze. You know that. She did. Mort. The weeks that followed were the slowest of her professional life, and also, in ways she hadn't anticipated, the most unexpectedly human. The investigation moved at the speed of institutions, which was to say, it moved in a way that was periodically maddening and occasionally inexplicable, but was ultimately, she came to understand, moving. Phelps's authorization code was traced through 3 administrative layers to a direct connection with a procurement officer who had also been coordinating with the opposition force's command structure through a cutout network that investigators had been tracking for 8 months without connecting it to anything actionable. The investigation became something larger than an IG action. She was interviewed 7 times by 4 different agencies over 6 weeks. She gave the same account each time with the same precision, and each time the interviewer looked slightly different afterward. Not convinced exactly, because people in those roles didn't process information in categories like convinced, but updated in the specific way that someone is updated when they've received information that changes the configuration of what they already knew. Phelps negotiated. She'd expected that. He was good at it, smart enough to understand what was provable and what required cooperation to establish, and to use that understanding as leverage. The negotiation took 11 weeks and produced an outcome that was not the outcome she would have designed. He retained his rank, but was removed from command, placed on administrative duty pending the broader investigation, which would continue for years without him in a position to influence it. It was less than he deserved. She knew that. She sat with it. The Ardell Corridor counseling was expunged from her record on a Tuesday in late March. in a brief administrative proceeding that took less time than the original counseling had. No ceremony. A form signed by two officers who weren't Phelps, a notation entered in the system, and 14 months of institutional damage quietly unmade on paper while the actual 14 months remained exactly what they'd been. She didn't expect a ceremony. She hadn't wanted one. What she hadn't expected was the letter. It arrived through official channels, which meant it had been processed and reviewed before it reached her. But it was personal in a way that official correspondence usually wasn't. Handwritten, on plain paper, in the slightly uneven script of someone who didn't write by hand often. Captain Voss. My name is Sandra Paris. My husband is Lieutenant Commander David Paris, who was part of the Crossfire element on December 24th. He told me what happened. He wasn't supposed to, but he told me anyway, and I'm glad he did, because I need you to know that my daughters, Emma is 7 and Lily is 4, woke up on Christmas morning and their father was there. I don't know how to write what that means. I've been trying for 3 weeks. I don't think there are the right words for it, but I wanted to try anyway, so you'd know. She read it twice, folded it, put it in the inside pocket of her jacket, against her chest, where it sat for the rest of the day. More letters came over the following weeks. Not a flood, nothing as organized as that, but a steady accumulation, parents and wives and husbands and children, each of them trying to put into language something that language wasn't quite built to contain. She read every one. She didn't know what to do with most of them except read them and feel the weight of what they were trying to say, which was enormous and simple at once. She wrote back to Sandra Paris. It took her 4 drafts to say what she wanted to say, and even the 4th draft wasn't quite right, but she sent it anyway because not sending it was worse. I'm glad he was there too, she wrote. Tell Emma and Lily their dad is good at his job. Her rank was formally restored in April. Not restored as she'd never technically been demoted. The paperwork hadn't gone that far. But the reassignment to the observation post was retroactively reclassified. Her operational status was reinstated, and she was offered her choice of posting. Holcomb delivered it personally, which she hadn't expected. He came to the temporary office she'd been using at the regional headquarters, a small room with a window that looked out at mountains she hadn't yet climbed, and sat across from her the way he'd sat across from her at Bravo Station, with the same directness that she'd come to understand was his genuine register rather than a formal posture. "Where do you want to go?" he asked. She'd thought about it. She'd had time to think about it. "I don't want a posting," she said. He waited. "I want a program." She'd been building the proposal in her head for 3 weeks, tightening it, testing it against the likely objections. Long-range precision instruction at the advanced level, not the basic qualification course. We have that. I'm talking about the decision-making architecture, how you identify targets, how you prioritize, how you manage a fire support problem with limited resources in adverse conditions. She held his gaze. The technical skill gets people through qualification. What I'm describing is what gets them through nights like December 24th. Holcomb was quiet for a moment. "You want to teach," he said. "I want to build something that didn't exist when I was coming through, something that addresses the gap between what the qualification courses test and what the actual environment requires." That's a significant, "I know what it is." She kept her voice level. "I also know that 381 people are alive because of a skill set that took me 15 years to build, and that nobody systematically teaches because nobody in the relevant positions has been in the environment where it matters." She paused. "I've been in that environment. I know what it requires. And I'm done being the only person who can do it." Holcomb looked at her for a long time. "Write me a proposal," he said. "I have one." She slid it across the desk. 12 pages, single-spaced, that she'd written in the evenings over the previous 3 weeks in the same small room. He picked it up, read the first page, turned to the second. She watched his eyes move through it with the focused attention of someone who read quickly and retained what he read, and she waited without fidgeting. He put it down at the bottom of page 4. "I'll need a week," he said. "Take 2. He almost smiled. "You'll need a co-instructor." "I have someone in mind." He raised an eyebrow. "Master Chief Hayes," she said. "Ethan Cross's senior enlisted advisor. He has the tactical background and the operational experience, and he was in that valley on December 24th, which means he understands the environment from the ground perspective. She paused. I spoke with him last week. He's interested. Holcomb looked at her. You've been planning this for a while, he said. Since about 04:30 on December 25th, she said. Give or take. The first class convened in September at a facility in the Western Highlands that had the benefit of terrain comparable to the Kestrel Range and the disadvantage of weather that was almost as bad. 18 students, 12 snipers at various career stages, 4 fire support coordinators, and 2 intelligence officers who had specifically requested inclusion because they wanted to understand what they were tasking when they tasked long-range precision assets. That last detail had been her idea. She'd pushed for it over Hayes's initial skepticism. They're not shooters, they're going to slow everything down, and had held her position because the thing that had nearly killed 381 people in December wasn't a failure of shooting skill. It was a failure of understanding between the people who collected information and the people who used it and the people who executed based on it, and you couldn't fix that failure by working on the shooting end alone. Hayes came around. He usually did, she was learning. He just needed the argument laid out plainly. She taught the first block herself, 4 days on the fundamentals, not the trigger press fundamentals, but the decision framework that existed before the trigger was ever involved. How to read an environment, how to identify what mattered in a complex target set when you couldn't address everything, how to manage finite resources, ammunition, time, physical capacity, against an infinite-seeming problem, how to maintain the clarity of thought that the work required under the conditions that the work actually occurred in, which were never the conditions that a clean range day prepared you for. She taught it without slides. She tried to put it in slides during the 3 weeks of preparation and found that it refused to sit in that format. It needed to be spoken the way complex things that lived in the body rather than on paper needed to be spoken, in the specific language of people who had done the thing and were trying to convey the texture of it rather than its outline. The students were good. A few of them were exceptional. One of them, a young sergeant named Daria Hollins, 26, with 4 years in service and the quality of attention that Rowan recognized from her own early training as the kind that processed at a different depth than average, asked questions that were better than some she'd been asked by people with 15 years on her. On the third day, Hollins raised her hand during a session on target prioritization. Captain, what do you do when the right decision and the authorized decision are different? The room went quiet. Rowan looked at her. She thought about 91 days on a mountain. She thought about a laminated card. She thought about 40 seconds of math with a machine gun killing people below her while she decided what to do with the decision that had already been made. You think about it before you're in the moment, she said, because in the moment, you won't have time to think, and whatever framework you've built beforehand is the only thing you'll have to work with. She paused. You think about what you're actually in service of, not the order, not the career, not the institution. The institution is a mechanism, not an end. What you're in service of is the people at risk and the outcome that's right. She let that sit for a moment, and you accept, clearly and in advance, that there are situations where those things diverge from what you've been told to do, and you decide, before the moment, not during it, who you are when that happens. Hollins was quiet for a moment. And if you get it wrong, then you get it wrong, and you carry it. Rowan held her gaze. But you're the one who decides what wrong means, not the person who gave you the order. The room stayed quiet for another beat. Then Hayes, sitting in the back with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who had personally experienced the practical application of exactly this principle, said, All right, break for 15, back here at 1400. The class filed out. Rowan stayed at the front of the room and looked out the window at the mountains. Different mountains than the Kestrel Highlands. Quieter ones at the moment. The snow was fresh and undisturbed on the upper slopes, the kind of clean that a landscape gets after a storm when nothing has moved through it yet. She'd be in those mountains later in the week with the class, running field problems in conditions that would be cold and miserable and exactly what the training required. She was looking forward to it. Hayes materialized at her shoulder with 2 cups of coffee, real coffee, He'd somehow obtained a machine for the instructor room that produced something that deserved the name, and stood beside her looking at the same view. "Good class," he said. "Give it a week. They'll get harder. They're supposed to get harder." He handed her a cup. "That's what harder is for." She took it, stood there for a moment. "Hollins is going to be exceptional," she said. "Yeah." He sipped his coffee. "She reminds me of someone." Rowan didn't answer that. Below the facility, in the valley that ran between the training range and the nearest town, she could see the road that wound down through the trees, the same kind of road that Ethan's column had reached on the morning of December 25th, exhausted and damaged and alive, the kind of alive that people are when they have arrived at something they should not have arrived at by any rational accounting of probability. She'd received a letter from him too, 3 weeks after everything. Not the formal kind, Barasat. 3 paragraphs typed, which she suspected meant he'd written it and deleted it several times before settling on a version that said what he meant without saying more than he'd decided to say. "You told me to get some sleep." "I did. When I woke up, my first thought was that you were probably already awake and already working on the next problem. I was right. Marsh told me you'd been writing since 4:30. I don't know what to do with someone like you, except make sure you stay pointed at the right problems. I intend to spend a fair amount of energy on that." She'd written back, "Focus on your own element. I'm fine." He'd written back, "I know you are. That's not the point." She hadn't responded to that one. She wasn't sure she needed to. On the last evening of the first week of training, after the class had gone to their quarters and Hayes had retired to the instructor building, Rowan walked up to the upper range alone, just to stand there for a minute, just to look. The range extended across a natural bowl in the highland terrain, the target positions visible in the fading light at distances that most people in the building below would find improbable. She'd set the targets herself at ranges that were not the longest she'd worked, but were the longest she was comfortable starting a class with, long enough to require genuine skill, short enough that the skill could be developed rather than merely demonstrated. The mountains beyond the range were settling into the early dark, the snow on the upper slopes catching the last of the light in a way that turned it briefly, improbably blue. She'd seen that light before, in the Kestrel Highlands, through the scope during the long static hours of the observation post, and she'd noted it then with the same clean attention she gave to everything, not dwelling on it, not making it mean something it didn't mean, but not letting it pass unregistered either. She'd spent a lot of time on mountains. She suspected she'd spend more. Her ribs had healed to, not perfectly. There was a spot along the lower left that still complained in cold weather, and cold weather in this region was not a rare condition. And the shoulder had come back to about 95%, which was enough. The hypothermia had left nothing lasting except a slightly increased sensitivity to cold that she'd adapted to without significant difficulty. She was not the same person she'd been 91 days into an observation post with a laminated card in her pack. She wasn't sure she was better. Better was the wrong category. She was more precisely herself. The accretion of everything she'd been through had not simplified her exactly, but had clarified the signal a little, stripped some interference, made it easier to hear what she actually thought beneath the static of what she'd been told to think. She thought about Sergeant Hollins's question. What do you do when the right decision and the authorized decision are different? You decide who you are before the moment arrives, she'd said. She'd decided who she was at 22:19 hours on December 24th, in a frozen observation post with the radio transmitting, "Do not engage" into her ear, and the valley below filling up with the unmistakable evidence of what happened when the wrong decision got made by the right authority. She'd reached over and switched off the radio. Not a heroic act, not a dramatic one, quiet and deliberate and certain, the way she did everything. She stood at the upper range and looked at the mountains and breathed the cold air and felt the specific satisfaction of a person who has survived the thing that was meant to end them and has arrived, improbably, at a place where the survival turns out to be useful. There was work to do tomorrow. There was always work to do tomorrow. She turned around and walked back down to the facility. The mountains behind her held the last of the light for a moment after she was gone, and then let it go, and the dark came in full and quiet, and the snow on the upper slopes settled imperceptibly deeper, and the valley below slept. Some people become legends because the world decided to remember them. Rowan Voss became one because, at the moment, everyone was deciding to look away. She decided to look back. And what she saw made the choice for her. The rules matter, but they were written by people for situations those people could imagine. What Rowan faced was a situation nobody had imagined. And in that space between what the rules could cover and what the moment required, she found the only answer that mattered. She chose the people. Every time, in every version of that night, she would have chosen the people. That is the only kind of courage worth remembering.